All right, welcome back, Biology 241 students. So far in the course, we've been working up the levels of organization of living things. Okay? So we started with chemistry because atoms come together to form bonds, which create molecules. Molecules can interact with each other to create larger structures like organelles or cells themselves. And so then chapter 3 was all about cells, their structure, and their function. And now we're moving on to the next level with specialized cells coming together to form tissues. Right? Cells can take on particular functions in larger multicellular organisms like humans. And groups of cells that have a similar function or will work together towards a similar function form tissues. And then these tissues are all going to interact together to support our various organs and organ systems. Right? So chapter 4 here is all about the different tissue types in the human body. And so most of these are going to be present in any given organ. Just the specifics of what kind of muscle tissue, what kind of connective tissue, what kind of epithelia show up in that organ are going to differ. But together, these 4 types are all necessary for the different functions, right? We have our nervous tissues, which are going to innervate, so sensory, sensing what they are perceiving, what stimuli are in that environment, and sending control mechanisms back to those organs. Epithelia, which are mainly going to be protective. They line all of the cavities of our body, whether that's outside of the organ or the internal cavity of that organ, including our skin, which interacts with the external environment, or the outer layers of organs like our eyes and our mouths, which interact with our external environment. That is all going to be lined with epithelia. Muscle tissue, which is going to constrict and dilate to change the shape or control, and is very important for our ability to move throughout our external environment by pulling on our skeleton. And then connective tissue, which is going to be in between all of these, essentially, right? This is what's holding your organs in their position, what is providing lubrication so that they can rub against each other without causing damage. Right? It's what connects muscle to your skeleton, what connects bones to other bones, right? All of that is connective tissue. But this also contains other tissue types like blood, and bone itself is a connective tissue. So all these different tissue types are going to typically show up together in our different organs and lots of different places within our body, but they serve particular functions. And they're all composed of cells that are working together for that one role. And so then moving on through the rest of this course, we'll start looking at specific organs, organ systems, or one particular tissue type at a time, right? We spend time focusing on the skin, focusing on bones, focusing on muscles, and then focusing on our nervous system. And then in A&P2, you'll get much more into the particulars of all the other organ systems that we don't discuss in this class. So we've been building our basis, right? The background that we need to then dive deeper into how the human body, as our main organism of focus, actually functions. So let's talk about tissue. So as I mentioned, as we were just discussing and looking at, we have these 4 major tissue types in humans: our epithelia, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. So in this PowerPoint, we're just going to briefly discuss muscle tissue and nervous tissue, since we will have entire chapters focused on muscle as a tissue and the various nervous systems, looking in depth at nervous tissue and how it is branched throughout the body and how it works in these different organizations of our different nervous systems. And so we'll be mostly spending time today talking about epithelia and connective tissue, and just briefly discussing bone as a connective tissue, because we will also be discussing that in depth in this course later on. All right, so starting with epithelia. So for all of our tissue types, we have some properties or characteristics that are unique to them, which is how we define that tissue. So for epithelial tissue, the characteristics of all epithelia are that they are polar, meaning they will have 2 distinctly different surfaces. We have our apical surface, which is what is facing towards whatever cavity that epithelia is lining. And then our basal surface, which is going to attach to a layer of connective tissue and keep that tissue in place, allow it to be flexible and bend and stretch, since a lot of our organs are going to need to be able to stretch. The second property of epithelia are that they are made almost entirely of cells. So as we move on to some of our others, especially like connective tissue, we'll have to pay a lot more attention to the matrix, the fluid and fibers that surround the cells within that tissue. But epithelia are basically all cells connected to each other. Where did my screen go? Okay, got the PowerPoint back up. Our third property of epithelia is that they are avascular. So the blood vessels do not permeate all the way into a majority of the cells that are making up our epithelia. So they are going to get most of their nutrients and remove most of their waste via diffusion or osmosis. And then the fourth property of epithelia is that they have the highest rate of replication and division, right? There's a lot of stem cells that are going to be producing a large amount of these cells at a high rate. Because these are the cells that are going to be lining all of our cavities, it is much easier for them to be damaged or die off or fall off, right? Think about your skin, where you've got 20 layers of like dead keratinocytes. And so those keratinocytes are continuously reproducing and moving closer to the surface, filling up with keratin and then dying to produce that protective layer, which is going to be exposed to a lot of friction. And so those skin cells can just fall off and we'll replace them very easily. Okay, so looking at these properties more in depth, like I mentioned, all epithelia have polarity. We have two distinct different sides to our epithelial cells. We have our apical surface, which is what is going to be facing whatever cavity this epithelia is lining. So a lot of our apical surfaces are going to have extensions like cilia or microvilli, which can either be used to move molecules across the surface of these cells, such as in our respiratory system, moving the air so that there is a higher rate of absorption of gases like oxygen and the release of gases like carbon dioxide and pushing those back out. Microvilli are extensions that are there to increase the surface area of that cell. So we'll find a lot of microvilli within our intestinal cells so that they have a increased chance of absorbing the nutrients that we are digesting throughout our digestive system. And then at the opposite end, we have our basal surface, which is going to have a bunch of these tight connections to the basement membrane. And that basement membrane has layers of connective tissue in it. So by forming these junctions, these tight connections with that basal surface, with that basement membrane, that allows flexibility for these cells and keeps them in place. Right? We'll also see a lot of connections on our lateral surface, holding neighboring cells together. But those mean these very different looking two sides of our cell are what give it its polarity. Right? Just like with polar molecules, where we had two distinct poles on the molecule, a slightly positively charged and a slightly negatively charged pole, the polarity of these cells is referring to the fact that we have distinct characteristics that are different on either side of the cell. So again, our apical surface facing whatever cavity, and then our basal surface, which attaches to the basement membrane, the connective tissue. And so we have lots of different I don't want to say options because it's not like we pick and choose, but a lot of different variation in how these cells connect to each other. So with neighboring cells on our lateral surface and connect to that basement membrane, holding it in place. So we'll take a look at all of them. So we have tight junctions, which are going to be essentially fusing of the plasma membrane, including cell adhesion molecules that act like glue, holding those neighboring cells together. And there is no diffusion of molecules at these tight junctions. We have an adhesion belt, which is directly attached to this terminal web near the apical surface, which is made up of a bunch of microfilaments, right, creating what looks like a web, like a spider's web. So those proteins holding that all together, creating some structure and support. We have gap junctions, which are going to be connections that have connexin proteins in it, which create channels for the free diffusion of ions and some small molecules between neighboring cells. Again, we don't have any vascularity in our epithelia, so all these nutrients are going to be moving around through these different cells through diffusion and absorption. And then we have spot desmosomes and hemidesmosomes. So a desmosome is considered like the super glue of the cell. It is mainly those cell adhesion molecules, which create a really, really tight connection, proteoglycans that hold on to each other really, really well. And so this keeps these cells from separating, right? So supports the integrity of that protective layer, right? So that there aren't molecules just making their way through the lining that should be connecting neighboring cells. So it is a complete continuous layer from those spot desmosomes. And then hemidesmosomes at the basal surface, hemi is a prefix meaning half, because we only have those cell adhesion molecules coming from the cell, the epithelia cell. You don't have that same thing being reciprocated from the basement membrane. So with our spot desmosomes, we have those coming from both of the cells connected. So we have cell adhesion molecules from this cell we're looking at in blue, and then this cell we're looking at in yellow, forming a full desmosome. And then hemidesmosomes at the basal surface are half desmosomes. We just have one cell creating these cell adhesion molecules. And those desmosomes will be connected to intermediate filament networks. So whereas our tight junctions were connected to an adhesion belt in some areas, which are microfilaments, and the tight junctions themselves are formed with microfilaments, desmosomes are connected to intermediate filaments. So we can look at these more in depth. So this is a closer look at gap junctions, which would be between neighboring epithelial cells. These gap junctions have gaps in them. So those connexon proteins, which create protein channels, so that small ions and small molecules can freely diffuse between neighboring cells, and this is how they are going to transfer their nutrients. Again, they're avascular, so we don't have blood vessels permeating in here to provide nutrients. Tight junctions have these tight interlocking proteins, which have the plasma membrane and neighboring cells essentially fused together. And those are microfilament protein fibers creating those tight junctions. There would be no diffusion or absorption in these areas. An adhesion belt is going to have some of those cell adhesion molecules, or CAMs, and is directly connected to the terminal web, which is a web of interconnected microfilaments themselves that is just under the apical surface, providing some flexibility and support. Here's a closer look at a spot desmosome. So you can see those cell adhesion molecules identified here, right? These proteoglycans that will connect with each other and create that cellular superglue holding neighboring cells together. Within the cell and the intracellular environment, these spot desmosomes are connected to intermediate filaments, holding them in place and creating some other connections within the cell. And then at the basal surface, we have our half desmosomes, these hemidesmosomes, which are going to connect with the connective tissue in that basement membrane. So all these different structures help hold our epithelial cells in place, either to the connective tissue underlining it or to its neighboring cells. So classifying epithelia, so these different names that we have for different types of epithelial cells, that classification comes from the shape of the cells. You can see we have squamous, cuboidal, and columnar based on the different shape of the epithelia that we're looking at. And they're also classified by their layers. So we can have simple, meaning there's a single layer. And if there is any more than one layer of those epithelia, we call that stratified. And so their names are going to refer to the number of layers first, and then the shape. So we can have simple squamous epithelium, simple because there's one layer, squamous referring to this flat shape, this scale-like shape. Or we could have stratified squamous epithelium, stratified referring to multiple layers, but we're still looking at squamous cells, flat scale-shaped cells. And that same idea applies for all of our different shapes. They could be simple or stratified, simple or stratified. So shape and layers, and naming them would refer to the layers first. We do have a couple other types of epithelia that don't follow this same classification because they don't really align with either category. And we'll take a look at that later, or when they come up, I suppose. So starting with squamous epithelia. So squamous is coming from the root word referring to scales. And so squamous epithelia have that really flat scale-like shape. And simple squamous epithelia would be one single layer of those squamous cells. These are really common. They're found in lots of different areas lining a majority of the cavities in between different organs, which are our pleural cavities. The pericardial cavity would be right outside of the heart. The peritoneal cavities would be the space in between your digestive organs. These are found in the lining of the heart and blood vessels themselves, portions of our kidney tubes, the inner linings of our cornea and our eyes, and the alveoli of our lungs. So they're present in lots of different places. And these are typically there to reduce friction. They help control our vessel permeability, so how much of the molecules are able to diffuse or be absorbed between different tissues. And they sometimes are performing that absorption and secretion themselves. So very common epithelia, again, a single layer of those scale-shaped cells. But these are the most delicate, so you won't find them in areas where there would be expected to be a lot of friction or a lot of stress. So they do provide some protection, but they can be quite delicate. We don't have a bunch of layers of dense, dead epithelia cells here, like in areas like our skin, again, which have lots of friction. So these can be delicate. Anyways. So where friction or damage is going to be more common, you would instead find stratified squamous epithelia. So these are much more common where you are interacting with the external environment, right, where there would be a lot of abrasions, a lot of rubbing, a lot of friction. So think about the surface of your skin, the lining of your mouth, the lining of your throat, esophagus, trachea and esophagus, the rectum, anus, and vagina areas where there is a lot of movement of so larger molecules or structures that are more likely to provide friction. So since we have multiple layers of these squamous cells, if some get rubbed off, that protection isn't completely removed, right? We have other cells below them that are still protecting the deeper connective tissue underlying it. So generally located in areas with high mechanical stress, protecting against that stress, as well as chemical damage, right? So not just friction, but potential exposure to chemicals that would damage our living cells that have higher functions. So our next cell shape is cuboidal, and they look almost like a cube in shape. Essentially, this is referring to the idea that all sides of the cell are generally the same length. So they're not exactly cubes, they're more of these round-looking circles, but they're not exactly spheres either, so cuboidal. Simple cuboidal epithelium are the most common of our cuboidal epithelium, but cuboidal epithelium in general are quite rare. They're just basically found in glands, areas where there's going to be a lot of secretion. So the simple cuboidal epithelium are more common, find them in most of our glands, as well as in our kidneys, again, where secretions are going to be released. Okay, so places where secretion is taking place and some absorption. Our stratified cuboidal epithelia are quite rare. They really only show up in some of our specialized gland types. So specialized sweat glands, basically, like mammary glands, which are a type of apocrine or sweat gland that is specialized to produce this more milky sweat, protein-rich sweat. And so when referring to glands could either be categorized as endocrine or exocrine, or rather, their secretions may be referred to as endocrine or exocrine. So endo is a prefix meaning in, exo is a prefix meaning out. So endocrine secretions are going directly into the circulatory system, whereas exocrine secretions are going into some space or the external environment. So a sweat gland is a exocrine gland secreting sweat onto the surface of your skin, exposed to the external environment, whereas an adrenal gland would be an endocrine gland secreting hormones into your blood directly, into the circulatory system. But again, these stratified cuboidal epithelium, where you would see multiple layers of these cuboidal cell shapes, are quite rare. Just some ducts, these specialized glands. So here we have one of our first weird epithelia that doesn't align with our classification criteria, and that is transitional epithelia. These cell types are going to change in shape depending on how much fluid essentially is filling the cavities that they line. So think about your bladder and kidneys, which are constantly going to be filling up with and releasing fluid. So when there is very little fluid and the organ itself has become condensed, compacted, the cells are going to look more like cuboidal cells. They'll be relaxed and they've been pulled together. So the cytoplasm stretches out the cell into that more round or cuboidal shape. But when there is fluid filling these cavities and that lining is going to stretch, they look more stratified, right? They're going to flatten out. And so this provides that ability to stretch, or at least assists in that ability to stretch, because we don't need to damage or rip apart the connections holding these cells together as they transition from that more stratified shape to the cuboidal shape and back. So our next cell type or cell shape within epithelia are columnar epithelia. So columnar epithelia form a column-looking shape. So they would be longer on two of their surfaces compared to the other two. So typically the apical and basal surfaces are going to be short, whereas the lateral surfaces will be long, like what you see here. And so in simple columnar epithelia, we just have one layer. So even though we have these long cell shapes, which may be as long as multiple layers of squamous epithelia, or it may be as long as stratified layers of cuboidal epithelia. This is one cell all the way from the basement membrane to the apical surface. So simple columnar epithelia, where we just have one layer, would be found in the linings of our digestive system. So these have all these microvilli lining our stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and those microvilli are extensions of the plasma membrane that increase the surface area facing that internal cavity of your digestive system, so that as your food is being digested and broken down into its smaller molecules, we are increasing the likelihood that those nutrients, those molecules, can interact with these plasma membranes and be absorbed into the cell, and then eventually absorbed into the cardiovascular system, right? Either directly into the blood or into the lymph. Right? And then we have pseudo-stratified ciliated columnar epithelia. So another of our weird epithelia cell types that doesn't necessarily align with our naming classification system. So pseudo-stratified, pseudo is a prefix meaning fake. So pseudo-stratified columnar epithelia, they will be columnar in shape, meaning they're long, and they look stratified under a microscope. So we have an example of that here. Looking at this, you can see multiple nuclei basically stacked on top of each other, which at first glance would easily be confused with a stratified epithelia. You would think there are multiple layers of cells here. But with a closer look, we could actually see that the cell membrane is going to go all the way from the apical surface to its attachment at the basal surface. So it does directly attach to the basal membrane. Every single cell that we see shoved in together here is going to go from the apical surface all the way down to the basement membrane. They just end up taking these weird shapes that make them look stratified. So these are pseudo-stratified. And they are typically, or almost always, ciliated, meaning they have cilia. Cilia are very similar to microvilli, except that they have movement and they have a different protein filament that causes these extensions of the plasma membrane. So they're both extensions of the plasma membrane. But the cilia can do that power stroke waving motion. And so these would be found in areas where we want to move the molecules in that environment across the surface of cells. And so think about your respiratory system or the male reproductive system, right? Where we're trying to move either the fluid or the air that you're breathing in so that we have a greater chance of absorbing that gas or moving that semen, all the other fluids that are in secretions that are being involved with their out of that reproductive tract. So pseudo-stratified columnar epithelia. They look stratified, but they're not. And then we do have some actual stratified columnar epithelia. So these would be in small areas of the pharynx and epiglottis of our throat. The epiglottis is that little muscular flap that protects essentially your airway. So when you swallow, that is going to be closed so that whatever you are swallowing is going down your esophagus instead of your trachea. But when we're breathing, that epiglottis will open so that air can get into the trachea and into the respiratory system instead. You'd also find these in your anus, the mammary glands, salivary gland ducts, and urethra. So these are just multiple layers of those long columnar shaped epithelial cells, and they're mainly just there for protection. So that is our epithelia. Again, epithelia are always lining any surfaces that are going to be exposed to some open cavity or environment. And then deep to our epithelia is always going to be some type of connective tissue. And in multiple areas, besides just deep to the epithelia, you're going to find connective tissue. Connective tissue may be filling those cavities. Connective tissue may be holding different tissues in place, different organs in place. Right? Connective tissue is also responsible for the transportation of a lot of nutrients. Right? Your blood is a type of connective tissue, or providing the structure of your body in general. Bone is a connective tissue. Cartilage is a connective tissue. So as the name suggests, a big part of what this tissue does is connect. But it has a lot of different roles. So I guess I'm kind of skipping ahead here, right? Our functions of connective tissue. They not only connect our organs and hold things in place, but they establish that structural framework with bone. They transport fluids with things like our blood. They protect your delicate organs. They support other tissue types. They store energy. Your adipose tissue is a type of connective tissue, which not only stores energy, but also protects against electrical damage and heat damage. And our connective tissue is responsible for a majority of our immune function, our immune system, defending against invading microorganisms. So just like with epithelia, we do have some basic components that we would expect to find or that we use to define what is a connective tissue. So connective tissue are highly vascular and have lots of sensory receptors, and we didn't see that with our epithelia, or at least the vascularity. Epithelia are avascular. They're never exposed to your external environment, or shouldn't be, if your body is maintaining the structure that it is designed to have. And they all share these three basic components. So whereas epithelia were basically all composed of just cells, with our connective tissue, we not only have the cells, but we have lots of fibers and fluid surrounding those cells. And so together, all of the organic and inorganic components that are surrounding the cells and connective tissue is referred to as our matrix. And that matrix is going to have protein fibers, providing a lot of that flexibility and structural support, as well as ground substance, which is going to vary greatly in our different connective tissue types. So the ground substance is referring to the fluid, which isn't always going to be fluid or liquid, but it is the fluid that surrounds and fills that space. So in between the connective tissue fibers and surrounding the cells of that connective tissue. And together, those two things, the fibers and ground substance, make up our matrix. So we'll have very fluid ground substance in things like our blood, and then very dense, solid ground substance in things like our bone, which is mainly made up of minerals. Talked about their functions. So classifying connective tissue, we have three different categories of connective tissue and a couple subcategories under this. So we have our connective tissue proper, which has a balance of all three of these components essentially. So we'll have multiple different cell types, a few different extracellular fibers, and then a viscous semi-fluid ground substance filling it. And that can be further separated into our loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue, depending on how much of those extracellular fibers are present, the density of those extracellular fibers. We have fluid connective tissue, where the ground substance is going to be mostly liquid, right? And so that's our blood and our lymph. And then we have supporting connective tissue, which has densely packed fibrous matrix. And so that's going to be our cartilage and bone, where the matrix isn't very fluid at all, and in fact is extremely solid, made up of minerals, our hydroxyapatite crystals. Right. So starting with connective tissue proper, it's going to be our most common type of connective tissue. In connective tissue proper, we have a balance of all three of our things, right? So the matrix has lots of different protein fibers in it and has a semi-fluid, a viscous fluid filling up the matrix. We then have a bunch of different specialized cell types. So we're going to see some common suffixes show up a lot as we talk about cell types. You can see a couple of them here. So the first one I'll address is blast. So the suffix blast is referring to an immature cell. Blasts are sometimes stem cells that are going to eventually mature into a mature version of that cell. So a fibroblast could eventually become a fibrocyte, and that suffix "cyte" refers to a mature cell of that cell type. But mainly, these blasts are going to be creating the matrix. They are going to be generating the protein fibers or producing the fluid that is filling the space. So a fibroblast is an immature fibrocyte that is going to be generating the protein fibers and fluid that fills the matrix outside of those fibrocytes. So "cyte" was going to be that second suffix, but I did address that already. The suffix "cyte" refers to a mature cell type that is going to be there to continuously maintain whatever matrix is surrounding it and produce the function for that cell, like a melanocyte, which is producing the protein melanin to give pigment and protect that part of your body. What else here? Those are really the only, oh yeah, phage. So the suffix phage is a cell that is going to do a lot of phagocytosis. So its job is going to be destroying invaders, so a lot of protection from any bacteria, fungi, viruses that are getting into that connective tissue. So your immune system has a lot of these phages. And then we have chyme or chymal cells, which are the main stem cells. They're to produce more of our blasts for our different cell types and doing a majority of the cell replication for our connective tissue. Okay. So these next couple slides are kind of like vocabulary dump or your reference slides. So fibroblasts, again, blast, meaning it is immature and is there to essentially create the supportive network, the matrix. These are the most abundant. The fibroblasts themselves are most abundant in connective tissue proper, and they produce those ground substance and fibers. Fibrocytes are the mature versions of those cells that are going to then maintain and upkeep the fibers and ground substance that have been produced by fibroblasts. Adipocytes, adipo is a prefix referring to fat. Adipocytes contain lipids. So they're mainly there for energy storage, protection. So they're lining a lot of our organs that are going to be rubbing against each other. Most of the fat in your body is just under your skin, providing protection and insulation from heat. The adipocytes around your heart are protecting the rest of your body from electrical stress. Mesenchymal cells, like I said, are those major stem cells that are going to be producing the blasts for all of our different cell types. They respond to injury and infection to start reproducing and replacing those damaged cells. Melanocytes are producing melanin, that pigment melanin, so the protein that is going to protect your skin from UV radiation, absorb those light rays, those photons that could damage the underlying cells. Macrophages are large phage cells, so they are part of our immune system. They are going to ingest and destroy invaders. And macrophages are kind of like free-flowing. They're found throughout our connective tissue. Mast cells circulate in the blood. These are what release histamine and heparin, telling our body to send more blood, right? Dilating the blood vessels so that more blood is getting to the areas of damage and starting that process of then constricting smaller blood vessels and forming blood clots so that you're not losing blood. Lymphocytes are the mature blood vessels of our lymph. They migrate through various tissues and can develop into other blood cell types. And then macrophages are small macrophages. Basically, they're just less common. Okay. So those are the major cell types of connective tissue proper. And then we have these three different types of fibers in the matrix of our connective tissue proper. So collagen is going to be the most common. It's basically rope, right? So everywhere that needs a rope-like network to support it and hold it there. Your tendons have a lot of collagen. Ligaments have a lot of collagen, right? They're very structurally stable as a connective fiber. Reticular fibers are thinner and form these branching networks that allow for some support from like expansion and then contraction. So where things need to constrict and dilate, like our blood vessels and nerves. And then elastic fibers, which are made of elastin. And as the name sounds, they have kind of this snap back property. So they will stretch and then reform their shape after that pressure has released. So these next couple slides are showing the first types of connective tissue that show up in embryo. So you can see our mesenchymal stem cells that are going to be producing a lot of the cells that will eventually differentiate and form the mature versions of these tissues, and blood vessels starting to form here. It's another view of that same thing as it's getting more mature, essentially. Okay. So now looking at loose connective tissues. So we have dense and loose connective tissues as subcategories of our connective tissue proper. And so as the name suggests, this is referring to how loose or dense the protein fibers are in the matrix of that connective tissue proper. So areolar tissue is often found where we need to hold other tissues together. So that basement membrane of our epithelia, or where the basal cells are attached to the connective tissue, is mainly going to be this areolar loose connective tissue. And so loose because we have a lot of these branching networks of elastin and collagen fibers. Right, so it allows for some stretching, but also provides support. Adipose tissue, like I said, is around a lot of our organs, and most of your adipose tissue is directly under your skin. This provides some padding and protection and also insulation. And so specifically like around your heart, it's protecting against damage from like electrical activity. And is insulating the heat of your skin and protecting against damage from temperature changes in your body. But it's also storing energy. So these are mostly full of triglycerides, so the fat that you have eaten or created in your body. And that fat is going to be your body's main source of energy at rest. So these adipocytes are constantly being filled with and then filled with triglycerides, and then we are withdrawing those triglycerides when we need access to that energy. Reticular tissue is holding most of our organs in place. So we have these reticular fibers, mainly reticular fibers. Okay? And that's going to be found in places where there needs to be support, some supportive framework and network. Okay, so now our dense connective tissues. So we have dense regular connective tissue, which is probably what you think of if you had previously thought about what would a connective tissue look like. I feel like the easiest examples to come up with would be your tendons and ligaments. So although this looks similar to muscle, right, we can see our actual muscle cells shown here. And then if we take a closer look at the tendon, which connects those muscle cells to the bone, that has a similar looking parallel shape with striations, all those little lines in it. These are not muscle cells. This is mainly collagen fibers providing those striations and those long networks. And then we have some fibroblasts throughout it. So these are really, really dense, mostly collagen fibers that provide a really structurally stable support system to connect these other larger structures that are going to be going through a lot of movement, have a lot of stress on them, right? So tendons connect muscle to bone, ligaments connect bone to bone. And then we have dense, irregular connective tissue. So this is found in between a lot of organs where tension is going to be exerted in various directions. So we have collagen in these fiber bundles instead of in those parallel networks so that it can resist tension in multiple directions. And we have elastic tissue. So this is going to be found in ligaments that need to be a lot more flexible. So like our vertebrae, right? The ligaments of our vertebrae have a lot of elastic tissue in it. So rather than holding that structure stable, it allows for some flexibility and movement. So the axis of our body can move around, right? And our vertebrae will stay connected to each other because of those elastic fibers. Fascia is a term referring to groups of these connective tissue layers around various organs. So such as with the example we're looking at here, deep to our skin, we can see all three of our different layers of fascia. So we have the superficial fascia, which would be the closest to the superficial part of our body, so closest to the skin. This has areolar and adipose tissue in it. So it's also what we're going to be referring to as the subcutaneous layer or hypodermis when we talk about skin. So this isn't technically skin, this is an epithelia, right? This is connective tissue. This is part of our superficial fascia. Deep to that superficial fascia, we have the deep fascia. So this is bound to the capsules, tendons, and ligaments. This is mostly dense connective tissue, forming that strong fibrous network for support. And then deep to that, which is going to be what is lining any connection to other organs, right, is the subserous fascia. So this is going to produce like a lubricant type fluid on it that allows for rubbing without much of that friction causing damage. Okay, so this is mainly areolar tissue. So we have our superficial fascia, and then our deep fascial layers, fasciae, and then the subserous fascia, that thin layer there. Okay. So that was all connective tissue proper, where we have a relatively even distribution of cells, protein fibers, and the fluid filling that matrix. So the other connective tissue types we're talking about are going to be mainly dominated by one part of that or another. So fluid connective tissue, as it sounds, is a very liquid matrix and not very many connective tissue, or not very many fibers, those protein fibers in the connective tissue. So it's mainly fluid with a lot of cells and very little protein fibers. And this is our blood. So we have a few different cell types in your blood. The most common are your red blood cells or your erythrocytes, which are mainly there for the transport of gases. So they're carrying oxygen to your cells and carrying carbon dioxide back to your lungs to be breathed out of your body. We have various types of leukocytes, or what may be referred to as your white blood cells, which are mainly there for defense and protection. So you have, a lot of these are going to be types of phagocytes. So they phagocytose, right, a type of endocytosis. They will bring in invaders and destroy them so that they don't damage the rest of your body. So we have monocytes, which are basically the macrophages of the blood. So they are our largest phagocytes here. We have lymphocytes, which are typically going to move in between other tissues and then specialize into a different type. We have eosinophils, neutrophils, and basophils, which are all different, or I guess specifically eosinophils and neutrophils are mainly phagocytes, there for protection, and then basophils are what promote inflammation when there is damage. So bringing more blood to that area so that we can get other cell types that are going to cause clotting and protection, and then starting to, like mesenchymal cells, to start reproducing the cells, tissue, and replace the damaged tissue. And then lastly, we have platelets. These are mainly just cytoplasm-filled pockets, essentially, that are going to become sticky and attach to areas of damage, and that allows for other cell types to stick to those platelets as well, and eventually form a blood clot, preventing blood cells from leaving the body or getting into other cavities in the body, if the platelets can get there fast enough. So these form our our blood clots. Okay. So that was our liquid connective tissue, fluid connective tissue. Sorry, my brain really wanted to say liquid. Our fluid connective tissue. Now we have our supporting connective tissue. So whereas the fluid connective tissue had a much larger concentration of fluid in its matrix compared to protein fibers, and then cells just floating within that fluid, supporting connective tissue is mainly going to be protein fibers and then a solid matrix instead of fluid. So this is going to be our cartilage and our bone, creating the supportive network for the body as a whole. So cartilage has a firm gel-like matrix, so not exactly solid. It's a lot more flexible. And most people are aware that like your nose and ears are a type of cartilage. And so even though they provide structure the way bone does, they're a bit more flexible. A lot of your bones are will have started off as cartilage and then be replaced by bone later. We have some cartilage tissue that sticks around in between some of our bones. And some cartilage tissue that sticks around longer than others, depending on where it is, etc. So cartilage. Cartilage, the mature cells of our cartilage connective tissue are called chondrocytes. They exist in these pockets called lacunae, which we'll also see with our osteocytes of bone. They end up surrounded by the matrix that they're producing, and so that forms a lacunae where that cell would be in the center. Cartilage is avascular, and so it's getting all of its nutrients via diffusion. And it's separated from surrounding tissue by perichondrium. So anytime you see this prefix peri, that is surrounding tissue around whatever it's next to, so perichondrium for your chondrocytes. Pericardial is referring to the tissue surrounding your heart, right? Those types of terms. So cartilage can grow through two different methods or strategies. We have interstitial growth, which is growing the cartilage from within the tissue. So we have a chondrocyte within its lacunae, which is separating it from the surrounding matrix. It will then replicate, right, go through mitosis, and then those two new lacunae will start to push away from each other as more matrix is being formed. So eventually these will separate, and now we've created more cartilage, and those will replicate and separate, creating more and more matrix, and now we've created more cartilage. So this is enlarging the cartilage from within the matrix, interstitial growth, inter meaning between, so within the matrix. But cartilage can also grow from apositional growth. So this is growing cartilage from the perimeter. So chondroblasts, these immature chondrocytes and immature cartilage cells, are going to be producing more of that matrix, which is going to push them away from that exterior, away from the perimeter, and deeper into the cartilage itself. And they will mature into chondrocytes that are now surrounded in their lacunae, and they'll continue to maintain that matrix. So cartilage is growing from within the cartilage as chondrocytes are going through mitosis and separating, and that is interstitial growth. And then cartilage is also growing from the exterior, the perimeter, which is apositional growth, as chondroblasts are maturing into chondrocytes and creating the lacunae and pushing away from the perimeter. So we have a few different types of cartilage as an overall tissue. We have hyaline cartilage, it's very common in our joints. So this has a relatively smooth semi-fluid matrix to it. So it provides stiff but somewhat flexible support for our joints. We have elastic cartilage, so it's what we connect with our ears. We have elastic cartilage down our throats. Okay? So this has a more flexible matrix, but a bit less fluid, more solid. And then we have fibrocartilage, which has the toughest matrix of our different cartilage types. So this produces the padding in some of our joints, like our knee joints, and the intervertebral discs, which is where we'll see it most commonly, this fibrocartilage. So bone is also a supporting connective tissue. We're going to discuss this a lot more in depth. We have a whole chapter on osseous tissue, which is our bone. So we're not going to talk a lot about it here. Basically, just knowing that it is a supporting connective tissue is all we're looking for here. We'll talk about the cell types. We have blasts and cytes, so osteoblasts, which are producing the matrix, osteocytes, which are upkeeping that matrix. Those osteocytes exist within lacunae, which we can kind of see here. These little black parts are the osteocytes. They're completely surrounded by matrix. So they have their own little lacunae, little pockets that they exist in. We also have osteoclasts, which do the opposite. Osteoblasts produce more matrix. Osteoclasts are going to break down that matrix. And that allows us to use our bones kind of like a bank for these minerals like calcium and phosphorus, where we can store them in the minerals that make up the matrix with osteoblasts. And we can break down that matrix to get more of it into our blood when we need more calcium or phosphate. But we'll talk more about that later. It's a reference slide just comparing cartilage and bone. Okay. Then here in the textbook, they slip in these different types of membranes that would be on the, essentially our epithelia or our cartilage, depending on where we're looking. And so we can have mucous membranes, serous membranes. We have our cutaneous membrane, which is just referring to the most superficial layer of the skin. And then synovial membranes, which is going to show up in specific types of joints, are synovial joints. We'll take a look at all of them. Mucous membranes are secreting mucus, which acts as protection for those cells. So think about your stomach, where we have specialized cells in our stomach that are secreting hydrochloric acid, which is extremely acidic, a pH of like 2, I believe. And so that extremely acidic fluid would damage other cells. And so we also have specialized mucus cells in the lining of our stomach that secrete mucus, which protects those underlying cells from that acid. And so anywhere where we have mucus being secreted, that is protection from the chemicals that it may be exposed to. Serous fluid is more of like a lubricant in between organs that touch each other, so it allows them to rub against each other without much friction. So think about all of the ventral body cavities, the cavities in between organs. We have our cutaneous membrane, which again is just referring to the most superficial layer of the skin, where we have multiple layers of dead squamous. So this is stratified squamous epithelium. They are dead keratinocytes. So the life cycle of your skin cells is they start as they mature and move more and more to the superficial layer of the skin. They're basically just producing as much keratin as they can and absorbing melanin from the melanocytes. And then as they get closer to the outer layer or superficial layer, they are going to start dying off, and instead will be these pockets full of keratin fibers. So that protects the deeper living cells and produces a very biologically inexpensive cell that can rub off with friction and be easily replaced. So it's just really referring to skin. And then we have our synovial membranes, which produce a special viscous fluid called synovial fluid. And so we just find this lining our synovial joints, which is a specialized type of joint. And most of the joints that you probably think of right off the top of your head are going to be synovial joints. So our ball and socket joints, like our shoulder and hips, our knees and elbows, are all synovial joints. And that fluid just helps with lubrication, allowing for movement. So our last two major tissue types to talk about are muscle and nervous tissue. We're going to just briefly discuss them here because, again, like with bone, we have an entire chapter focusing on muscle as a tissue, and then we have multiple chapters where we're going to be discussing nervous tissue, essentially. So we're just going to do the brief overview of different types of muscle tissue and their characteristics and properties, and same thing with nervous tissue. Something that is similar between these two that was not present in epithelia or connective tissue is that both muscle and nervous tissue have the ability to conduct electrical signals. So that is a property to keep in mind that is specific to muscle and nervous tissue, but not connective or epithelia. So we don't have nervous control, whether that's somatic or visceral, of our epithelia and of our connective tissue. But we do have some control mechanisms related to muscle and our nerves. So we have three different types of muscle tissue. We have skeletal muscle tissue, which is most of the muscles that you think of. These are what are attaching to the skeleton, either attaching the skeleton, a bone to another bone, right? So that we can pull on that bone, which provides movement, or just attaching that bone to some other structure. So like the diaphragm, which isn't really pulling on your muscles, but rather changing the space for our lungs. So skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is unique for a few things. It is the only type of muscle that we can control somatically. So you can use conscious thought to control any of your skeletal muscles. We do have some skeletal muscles that are automatic, meaning they are being activated involuntarily. You don't have to think about them, but when you want to control them, you can. So your diaphragm, the muscles that control blinking, the muscles that control swallowing, we have skeletal muscles involved with all those systems, and you don't have to think about blinking. You don't have to think about swallowing. You don't have to think about breathing. Those are happening involuntarily, but when you want to, you can control them. I can constrict or relax my diaphragm to force out a breath or breathe in deeper. I can force my eyes to blink shut. And I can force myself to swallow, but those are also happening automatically, involuntarily. So all skeletal muscle has some sort of somatic control to it. You can think and control it consciously. Skeletal muscle is also unique in that it is multinucleate. So these are going to be really long cells that extend along the length of the entire skeletal muscle. So if we think about our biceps, one skeletal muscle cell is going all the way from origin to insertion, extending the entire length. And so we have a multiple parallel muscle cells going that entire length. And those are really, really long. And so those are created by multiple immature muscle cells that end up fusing their cytoplasms together. And so you end up with a multinucleate cell where you have multiple nuclei along that stretch. And this is one of, I think, two, maybe three cell types in the human body that has multiple nuclei. So skeletal muscles are unique from our other muscle tissue because they are multinucleate. Each muscle cell extends the entire length of the muscle, and they have these striations. So those are all characteristics to look for. Those striations are formed from parallel myofibrils, which are the contractile units of our skeletal muscles. We'll talk more of that later. And skeletal muscles do not branch. That part is important because as we move on to our cardiac muscle tissue is also striated, but it does branch. It does not run the entire length surrounding the heart, right? But it does have these striations. So if you're looking at muscle tissue under a microscope or asked to identify it, and you see those striations, the way you could separate this from your cardiac muscle tissue is, does it run the entire length? So is it branching, or does it go from end to end? And does it have multiple nuclei? Because again, only skeletal muscle have multiple nuclei. So cardiac muscle tissue is also striated, and this is specific to just your heart. So it, rather than running the entire length surrounding that heart, it forms these branches that connect through intercalated discs. And this allows for the heart to have its pacemaker capacity, where essentially the signal to contract is going to move from one muscle cell to the next in a pattern rather than contracting the entire muscle at once. And so the heart can follow that pacemaker idea, pushing blood from one chamber to the next until it's all the way out. So they are uninucleated. They only have one nuclei in each cell. They form those branches and they connect to other cardiac muscle cells through these intercalated discs. And so skeletal muscles are our only voluntary conscious muscles. You don't have any control over your cardiac muscle tissue. You don't have any control over the contractions of your heart, at least not conscious control over the contractions of your heart. And then smooth muscle tissue. This is also automatic, visceral. We don't control this consciously. And smooth muscle tissue looks much different than our other two. We don't have any striations. It is branching, forming these overlapping networks with each other. They're not all parallel. And so this is mainly for stretching and constricting areas that you don't consciously control. So all of your visceral organs, your blood vessels, and those are going to be mainly surrounded with smooth muscle tissue. So uninucleate, non-striated, we don't have those myofibrils, those parallel myofibrils, and they're loosely packed. Then our last tissue type is nervous tissue. We're just going to briefly address essentially the cell types and the basic structures of what they do. But like I said, we have a whole chapter on that later. So nervous tissue is composed of neurons, which are what can conduct those electrical signals from one to the other, eventually ending up on a muscle cell of some type. And then we have the supportive cells that we call glia or ganglia. So the glial cells of our nervous system are going to have different names, different physical elements. So they look different and different functions depending on which nervous system they are a part of. So the two main different nervous systems are our central nervous system, which is composed of our brain and spinal cord, so along the axis of your body, and then the peripheral nervous system, which is referring to all the nerves that have left the spinal cord or the brain. Or I guess typically, specifically the spinal cord, right? The peripheral nervous system are the nerves that extend out of the spinal cord. And so the glia of the central nervous system are more specialized. We have more of them. We have astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, microglia, and ependymal cells, stem cells. And then in our peripheral nervous system, we just have two types. And mainly, we're just worried about Schwann cells. Satellite cells are a bit less common. We'll talk about the specifics of what each of those cell types do when we get into that chapter. And so this is a general look at what a neuron could be shaped like. All the basic structures of a neuron will be present in all of our different neuron cell types, but they don't all look exactly like this. This is just the most common that we see. So we have a cell body, which is going to have all of our major organelles that we associate with cells, so our nucleus, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus, etc. Those are all going to be found in this cell body. We have dendrites, which form these tree-looking branches, and dendrites are what are going to be receiving signals from the previous neuron. Neurons send their signals down their axon. So this is mainly going to be composed of protein channels along the membrane of the axon, the axolemma, that are going to be opening and closing to allow for sodium and potassium to move in and out of the cell, which sends that electrical signal down the length of the axon, ending on our telodendria. And then the telodendria will release neurotransmitters, which will start another signal, either on a neuron or on the muscle cell, telling it to contract. So we have our body, dendrites, which receive signals, axons, which are where the signal is sent, and then our telodendria, which is where that ends, essentially where it contacts with the next cell. And we're not going into any more in depth than just that, just a basic look at what a neuron looks like and a quick introduction to the cell types of that supportive network, the glial cells. So with all that together, you have been introduced to all of the major tissue types in the human body, general idea of what they all do. But like I said, in any given organ, you would likely find examples of all four of these. So becoming familiar with the properties and the functions that we associate with each tissue type. Some of the more specifics about epithelia and connective tissue is mainly the focus of this chapter for us, because we will later go much more in depth about nervous, muscle, and osseous tissue, bone. So as always, if you have any questions, please reach out, and I will see you guys in the next recording.